This week on YCN Vermont Wrap, we'll take a look at some of the top news stories from the past few days from across the state. Then John Dodge will join us from Newbury, Vermont. John's the co-director of the Vermont Citizens Defense League and one of the people that was banned by Governor Phil Scott from the official governor's Facebook page. Well, now the ACLU is involved. We'll get his take on that and the damage control efforts that are being made by the governor's staff. And on this week's Political Potpourri, I'll be stepping into the conservative confessional. You may be surprised by the revelation that came to me earlier this week. You're watching YCN Vermont Wrap. Come on, let's go have some fun. Welcome back to YCN Vermont Wrap. I'm Keith Hanson. As you're probably aware, this program airs Saturday evenings at 6:30 p.m. and then again on Sunday evening at 7 p.m. Now, at this exact moment, it is 1:25 in the afternoon on Saturday. So, at this exact moment, we're a week and a day away from the first ever state government shutdown here in Vermont. Now, I've got mixed feelings about this, but first, a little bit of background on this. Yesterday, the House repeatedly delayed a vote on the third bill drafted in the budget fiasco. This one valued at $5.8 billion. Now, we're dancing around the July 1st deadline because Scott, the negotiator-in-chief, is standing his ground. He's playing tough. He's rolling up his sleeves and sending a clear message to the progressives in this state: don't screw with me. I'm a fiscal conservative. Well, permit me to digress for a moment. If only he'd shown that level of testicular fortitude, that's balls for the layman, in protecting the rights of law-abiding gun owners, he wouldn't have created the proverbial crack in the dike. That's going to trigger a bunch of them, which will, you mark my words, only serve as a foundation for even more draconian restrictions on your Second Amendment rights. I'm sorry, a little bifurcated thought process there. But now, despite the fact that it would appear that I'm beating up on Scott, I have to say I'm actually admiring his fiscal resolve. In all seriousness, I believe that resolve should extend to every issue that he's asked to address and every bill that he's asked to sign into law. Now, as far as this budgetary Mexican standoff is concerned, that's number two, Vermont Senate President Tim Ash has said that Scott did not seek compromise with the democratically controlled legislature. Now, I love it when progressive Democrats lecture people about compromise. Let me define this for you. When a big government progressive says compromise, what they're really saying is capitulate, surrender, give in, acquiesce. Let us have our way. Like a spoiled child who throws a temper tantrum when they can't get that toy or the candy bar in the checkout lane. Now, let's be honest. The government doesn't shut down. Department of Public Safety Commissioner Tom Anderson will not be sending out an agency-wide email telling state troopers to stay home and not report in for duty. If that were to occur, well, there'd be carloads of heroin and fentanyl flying up and down the interstates, which, I don't know, I guess when you really think about it, is already a standard occurrence anyway. But again, I digress. During a governmental shutdown, non-essential departments and non-essential personnel take a temporary hiatus. Now, if you really want to solve the budget crisis, here's what you do. You figure out what departments and what personnel would be affected by the shutdown and then simply eliminate them. If they're useless enough to put on hiatus, they're non-essential. That means it's an expenditure we can learn to live without. During the early stages of comedian Steve Martin's career, he did a stand-up bit on how you can become a millionaire and not pay taxes. In one of his Saturday Night Live opening monologue segments, he broke it down like this. Step 1, get $1 million. Step 2, don't pay taxes. Step 3, when the IRS comes a knocking, simply utter 2 simple words. I forgot. Well, I'm not here to speculate on ways that you can avoid paying taxes, but we can talk about ways that you can achieve that often sought-after $1 million mark. You can work hard, be frugal with your household finances, and maybe, if the state of Vermont doesn't take it away from you, you can save $1 million. You could start a business in a more business-friendly state, and with hard work, dedication, sacrifice, and perseverance, you could amass $1 million. Or you could simply seek financial advice from good old Bernie Sanders. Because this is year number 2 that he's posted over $1 million in earnings. A fantastic June 22nd article by Vermont Digger reported that Bernie, the champion of the little guy, posted $1.06 million in income in 2017, with approximately $886,000 of that from book royalties and advances. Not too bad. Sanders recently received a $500,000 advance against royalties for a 320-page hardcover due out later this year, titled Where We Go From Here. That's a publication that many speculate will precede a 2020 presidential bid. He also received roughly $306,000 in royalties from his 2016 book, Our Revolution. Now, the best part of the article is the part in which the article's co-author, Ann Galloway, asked the junior Vermont senator's senior political advisor, Jeff Weaver, if Sanders' message of wealth inequality and his railing against millionaires and billionaires and the 1% were undermined by his extended influx of easy cash. Weaver's response? Quote, "That was a pretty funny question. Bernie Sanders continues to fight for working class people across the country, so I think it's a pretty ridiculous question." End quote. Now, I, for one, don't think that's a ridiculous question. In fact, I believe it to be a perfectly legitimate question that simply cannot be answered honestly without highlighting, underscoring, and bold-facing Bernie's hypocrisy. Now, if you listen to my 2 daily radio programs with any degree of regularity, you've heard me talk extensively about cultural warfare being the necessary lifeblood of progressive Democrats. Cultural warfare creates victims. Victims are literal currency to progressives. Victims are turned into votes and literal money. And Bernie is living, breathing, cash-devouring proof of this. And finally, the city of Burlington closed 2 beaches this past Wednesday due to high levels of E. coli bacteria in sections of Lake Champlain, only to have them reopened the very next day. Burlington's Department of Public Works said the high bacterial levels were likely caused by the roughly 150,000 gallons of storm and wastewater that flowed into the lake following Monday's heavy rains. Escherichia, or E. coli, is a type of fecal coliform bacteria commonly found in the intestines of both animals and humans. Now, I don't want to draw any conclusions here, but I'm going to let you put 2 and 2 together. Bernie Sanders has a house on the lake. Bernie Sanders and his message of utopian socialist bliss is completely and utter horse. The very type of bacteria found in horse has been found in elevated numbers in the lake water around Burlington. So wouldn't it be more appropriate to say that the lake water has tested positive for elevated levels of Sanders' socialist rhetoric? We're going to take a quick break, but when we return, John Dodge will share with us his experiences with the governor's social media. John is the co-director of Vermont Citizens Defense League. He joins me from Newbury when YCN Vermont Wrap continues. Welcome back to YCN Vermont Wrap. I'm Keith Hanson. It's no secret that Governor Phil Scott has had his share of critics, and those critics came out en masse when Scott signed the gun control bills, collectively and colloquially referred to as S-55. Well, Scott's administration got fed up with feeling the heat, so they began to delete comments and block certain more vocal constituents from being able to participate in online social media discussions, specifically Facebook. One of the governor's critics just happens to be the co-director of Vermont Citizens Defense League. No surprise there. John J.T. Dodge joins me from Newbury. J.T., welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Keith. Glad to be here.
My pleasure. So you have an established history with the governor. You know him. You've done some campaign work for him. I mean, in at least in as much as that you've promoted him on social media. So obviously being a part of that social media presence is something that you're familiar with. And there's a number of other people, too, throughout the state that have taken to his social media page to say, oh, listen, I'm going to share my thoughts with him. That's kind of the idea of social media, is for people to be able to have those conversations, talk to one another back and forth, share ideas, so on and so forth. At what point did you realize that there was some internal policing of the Facebook page going on behalf of Governor Scott through his staffers?
Well, we're a fairly tight-knit community, the gun rights folks, and I was able to sort of work with a friend of mine in the field here, Liz Mason, and she was paying pretty close attention to these things, and she thought she had noticed some posts were being removed. So I I went up and I got on the governor's Facebook page and I verified that indeed they were literally disappearing before my eyes. I would refresh the page and they'd be going away. And then shortly thereafter, I don't recall if it was a day or so later, I was completely blocked. The page says I can like things, but no, I can't like things. And I think that the page was completely, well, cleaned of my posts and many others, including Liz Mason and others as well.
So give us an example of what some of the posts that were scrubbed off of the page would have contained. It was, was there, I'm assuming that there probably wasn't profanity in it, nothing that wouldn't be appropriate for younger eyes, but what were the sentiments that were being expressed in those posts that eventually got scrubbed?
Well, there's a lot of animosity. We stood behind the governor, and he did the opposite of what he said he was going to do. He got, I know this is a little bit on the side, but he stood in front of gun owners of Vermont, and he stood there and signed a piece of paper that said what he was going to do. So it was very clear. So the posts, they were angry. Were they bigoted? They weren't. Were they profane? They weren't. They would, there were a few there, people calling him a tyrant, but, I cut them some slack on that because he's acting like one. To wipe he passed all this gun control that, limited the rights of the average Vermonter. It's, you've got your 18, 19, 20-year-olds, that can't buy guns now. They have to jump through some hoops to have their right to bear arms. They aren't the ones that are running around killing children in schools for the most part, if you look at the numbers. They really aren't. It's those that are younger and those that are older, but it's not this particular group. Everybody's just really angry that Governor Scott passed all this legislation and he didn't make the schools any safer. And, it's useless, this gun control, as most gun control is. As well as I do, that the criminal finds a way and he isn't consulting the law.
We need to take a quick break. More of my discussion with Vermont Citizens Defense League co-director John J.T. Dodge when we come back. Welcome back to YCN Vermont Wrap. I'm Keith Hanson. I'm joined by John Dodge, the co-director of Vermont Citizens Defense League. JT, again, thanks for being a part of the program this week.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Keith. Glad to be here.
So, JT, what's interesting about this is that there are a number of incumbent politicians and also governmental agencies that have done exactly what it seems Phil Scott's staffers are doing, which is to delete certain comments on social media and to block access to some of the more vocal members of that online community. And the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, who normally I would be ranting and raving about, I oftentimes call them the American Communist Lawyers Union, but here's a situation where even a broken clock is right twice a day. The ACLU has stepped in and said, wait a minute, this is tantamount, this is censorship, and it has to stop.
I guess what I can say about that is that I don't normally think of the ACLU as a group that would stand up for us gun-owning, law-abiding citizens either. But in this case, I got to give them a little bit of credit that they stood forward on behalf of gun owners and gun rights people and good citizens, and they stepped up on our First Amendment right. And I've got to give them a thumbs up on that one. It was unexpected, but certainly they've been right on top of this.
Now, Scott's administration, specifically Rebecca Kelly, put out a memo earlier this week. What were the contents of that memo, specifically addressing the social media, specifically the Facebook issue?
Yeah, the memo basically said that it drew a line just basically covering all the posts, saying that they were bigoted, they were inciting hateful feelings and these sorts of things, and that we were generally there to completely disrupt.
JT, in the memo that was released by the Scott administration earlier this week, is there any indication of who was responsible for actually making those deletions? And does Scott's administration take any responsibility for that?
So as far as I can see, I'll answer the latter one first. There really isn't anybody that's taken responsibility specifically that I can see. And I think it's really important for us to find out exactly who's responsible for this. We really do want to look the person in the face and see who it was, what their motivation was. We want to understand this.
Well, I think the motivation is pretty clear. Scott wants to be left alone in the wake of a decision that many people feel was an abdication and a dereliction of his duty and the oath that he took to the Constitution when he was sworn into office.
Absolutely.
Well, and, as they say, the band plays on here, and we'll have to see what happens with this. Certainly with the ACLU, again, normally I'd be tearing them apart, but I have to say, I mean, this is a perfect example of where that broken clock can be right twice a day. Censorship, when it comes to government, when it comes to our elected officials, cannot be tolerated. And I, for one, have to say I appreciate the efforts that the American Civil Liberties Union is making to address this issue. And JT, I certainly do appreciate the efforts that you're making, not only in this arena, but certainly in your capacity as co-director of Vermont Citizens Defense League, along with your other co-director, Eddie Garcia. Guys doing a great job over there. Thank you so much for being a part of YCN Vermont Wrap this week.
Thanks for this coverage, Keith. I really appreciate it.
Anytime. And be sure to let us know what's going on in the form of an update, okay? We'll be sure to bring it to our viewers.
I will do.
All right, thank you. Coming up next on YCN Vermont Wrap, I'll be stepping into the conservative confessional on this week's edition of Political Potpourri. I've had a socio-political awakening of sorts, and I'm going to share those realizations with you right after this. Welcome back to YCN Vermont Wrap. I'm Keith Hanson. In this week's Political Potpourri segment, I'm going to take a moment and step into the conservative confessional. And here's where I'm going to share with you some of my thoughts from this past week. I guess I'm wrong. Now, they say that confession is good for the soul. And now that I've said that, it's amazing how truly and wonderfully refreshing it is. Now, I guess all of my life, since I first registered to vote and selected my party affiliation, I've been on the wrong side of the issues. I'm wrong about religion. I'm wrong about politics. I'm wrong about social issues. Now, what would you ask has caused me to arrive at this startling and groundbreaking revelation? Well, the simple answer is I've been paying attention to the message of progressive Democrats. You see, progressive Democrats, it would appear, really are correct about virtually everything. In fact, I don't know why Republicans are referred to as the right. That's a misnomer. That's a title that clearly belongs to Democratic progressives. Hell, they are the right party. Republicans are truly on the left. They're the ones that are wrong. You see, progressive Democrats really do have all of the answers to life's big problems and little issues. They can legitimately claim the moral high ground as they are the ones that are out there day in and day out fighting for the little people. And I called myself a Republican. I hang my head in shame. The Democrats are 100% about health care. That's correct. 100%. It is a fundamental right, after all. It's a fundamental right that you avail yourself of somebody else's hard work, their intelligence, and their labor. The government should run a sector that's equal to 1/7 of our nation's economy. Doctors should be told how much they're going to make and how much they're going to charge for any of the procedures that they perform. And academics like Ezekiel Emanuel and Jonathan Gruber, these are the brilliant minds that truly understand the complexities of providing health care to the masses. And best of all, they say they can do it without health care rationing and viability assessments and the rest of that nonsense that Republicans say will happen. And because these central planners and academics are so far beyond the average person in terms of intellect and moral development, we really should simply acquiesce to them and the notion that they do know what's best for us. And speaking of the economy, the Democrats, they're spot on about that too. The citizens of this country are far too stupid to be able to make their own choices and their decisions. Frankly, it's a damn good thing that Democratic progressives are there to teach them the correct ways of thinking. The fact is, the free market system is a farce. It's a lie that greedy capitalists spew out in order to convince the simpleton masses that they too can have their own slice of the American dream. The Democrats have established that they alone have the ability to choose winners over losers. There are countless examples abound. The public-private partnerships and government prop jobs nationally like Solyndra, SunPower, and First Solar. These are industries, these are businesses that have flourished after having been chosen for their viable business models. In fact, the state of Vermont has got it wrong. They should be looking to get into bed with the weakest and most economically non-viable entity, and thus guarantee their perpetual existence with a healthy infusion of cash that's confiscated from the taxpayers. We should never question the government's ability to recognize the opportunity to make a profit. Now, I would question who these ridiculous Republicans are that say that the government doesn't produce anything. We need to look at clear evidence. Amtrak Food Service. There's a perfect example of a successful foray into the world of production and sales. They provide a wide selection of delicious and equally nutritious meals like the Natural Angus Burger for a mere $12. And who wouldn't want to start their day off on a train with a delicious 3-egg omelet with Swiss cheese for $13? Now, the Republicans would have you believe that it was mismanagement that caused that locomotive-pulled festival of gastronomic delight to lose $834 million over a 10-year span. But I assure you, it only failed because pesky Republicans got in the way. And don't even get me started on guns or the Second Amendment, because Democrats, you guessed it, are right about that too. People don't kill people, guns do, in record numbers. And we simply cannot trust people who believe in free markets and personal responsibility and all of that crap to walk around with the power of life and death strapped to their hip, or in their cars, or in their homes. The Democrats know that once you surrender your guns and your control over to their central planners, you'll breathe a sigh of relief at how much safer you're going to feel. Now, I'm so glad that Democrats opened my mind and that I was able to finally come to understand that even though I was born with a penis, I may not really be a man. That I could be a male, but that I could also be a cisgender, bigender, binary, non-binary, genderqueer, demi-guy, bisexual, transgender, pansexual, polysexual, gender fluid, androgynous, or simply agender. Now, another confession. Admittedly, this has complicated my dating life ever so slightly. By the time my date and I actually figure out what the hell we really are and exactly what the other person is looking for, we've well past the dessert course. But hey, let's not left swipe on that discussion prematurely. What's worth doing is worth doing properly and justly and equitably and fairly. The Democrats have really gotten it right when it comes to immigration, too. The thought that someone simply crossed an imaginary line that a bunch of old, rich, white slave owners drew on a map like a million years ago shouldn't prevent someone who has no viable means of supporting themselves from coming into this country. After all, that's what our welfare system is for. We're the richest nation in the world. There's enough money to go around. And I reject this Republican assertion that these people need background checks. Well, we should just give them the benefit of the doubt and stop stereotyping them. After all, they're coming here looking for a better life. If they are criminals, well, they'll self-reform. Oh, and while I'm on the subject of criminal justice, maybe if these heartless Republicans would practice actual compassion, we could stop warehousing undocumented immigrants in prison simply because they happen to accidentally kill overprivileged white people and toxically masculine frat boys. We need to get these pilgrims into comprehensive restorative justice programs that could teach them victim empathy. And for the love of God, we have got to stop enforcing the laws that we've had on the books for over 2 decades. The very laws that are now directly resulting in children literally being torn out of the arms of their mothers and thrown into dark, urine-soaked dog kennels lined with nothing but pages from the Bible and the Federalist Papers, along with a sheet of Tyvek house wrap for a blanket and a poorly made imitation frijole manufactured by a culturally appropriating food service factory in Hoboken. What we really need to be doing is figuring out how we can fast-track them into the Vermont public school systems, where their re-education can begin post-haste. Now, when I really think about it, I'm simply overwhelmed at how wrong I've been throughout the majority of my adult life. So I'm going to go make a nice soy chai latte and reflect on the wisdom of people like Bill Ayers, Robert Reich, Peter Shumlin, Rebecca Holcomb. I hope that my new Democrat friends can see past the transgressions of my misspent adulthood and take comfort in my pledge to becoming the very best global citizen that I can be. That's going to do it for this weekend's edition of YCN Vermont Wrap. Thanks to Vermont Citizens Defense League co-director J.T. Dodge for joining me on the program this week. And as always, be sure to share your thoughts with me about this week's show. Make a note of the new email, please. It's khanson@ycnnow.com. That's khanson@ycnnow.com. Be sure to let me know the name of the city or town that you live in as well. And be sure to follow me on Twitter @RealKeithHanson. That's @RealKeithHanson on Twitter. Enjoy the first weekend of summer, everybody. Have a great one.